Well, without boring you with a 50-year history, it is fair to say that Badgerys Creek Airport has been a long time coming. In recent years, we've seen a number of further inquiries into this gathering pace. Under Labor's most recent time in office, we saw an investigation in 2012 into the aviation constraints at Kingsford Smith Airport. Then in 2013, looking into possible locations, which once again recommended Badgerys Creek. Tony Abbott in 2014 finally made the decision. Yes, they want to go ahead with the Badgerys Creek Airport. And today, we've seen the final plans approved by the government. But there are still a number of questions. And the top of the list has to be, surely, who's going to build it? The Sydney Airport Corporation, which owns Kingsford Smith Airport in Sydney's east. It has first right of refusal, so it's the first port of call as to whether it says yes or no. Then we still don't know really much about the rail links that may or may not be built to the airport, nor have the final flight paths been settled here as well. Pretty important issues for whoever's going to pour billions into this, you would think. But the government is certainly saying today is a very significant day. The clearance given for takeoff at Badgerys Creek. And with me now is the Minister responsible for all this, the Minister for Urban Infrastructure, Paul Fletcher. A very good afternoon to you. Let's start with this question about who's going to actually build it, who's going to pay for it, who's going to build the Badgerys Creek Airport. Is it going to be the Sydney Airports Corporation?
Well, good to be with you, David. And yes, you're right, just to start with, to say that today is a significant day because what we've announced is the final approval of the airport plan for Western Sydney Airport. In a way, this is like the development application, the development approval if you're building or renovating a house. So this is the regulatory approval, meaning that the airport is now in a position to allow construction to commence, and that follows very detailed work over the last year or two. A draft environmental impact statement was issued, then a final environmental impact statement, approval of that recently, now the final airport plan. And so all
just on that, if I can just jump in, from the draft environmental impact statement to today, what's changed in terms of the airport plan?
Well, look, there's a number of extensive environmental conditions that are now part of the airport plan, and whoever builds the airport will have the responsibility to meet those conditions. There's a series
now, one of them, okay, but just to pick up on one of them, I understand it is that you can't have what's it called, a single merge point over a residential area. Just explain that to us and what that's going to mean for whoever builds this airport.
Yes, so that goes to the question of the flight paths that aircraft will use as they come into land. And the government has established a number of principles which we will require to be followed in determining the final flight paths. One of those is that there must not be a single merge point over any residential area, and that's a commitment that we've made following community consultation. So the environmental impact statement, or the draft when it was issued last year, generated some 5,000 submissions from the community, and there were a number of submissions dealing with the issues of the flight paths, and so we've made that particular commitment. Another important commitment that is reflected in the environmental impact statement and the airport plan is in relation to nighttime operations. And what we've said is that...
Can I come to that in a moment, but just on this merge point, does that mean if you're going to have no single merge point, and I get that would obviously mean a lot of noise for whatever point that is over the map, but does it mean that other places like Greendale and Silverdale will cop more noise? I see some are suggesting that's one of the consequences of this decision.
Well, what it means is that the impact of noise is going to be spread as fairly as possible. What's going to happen from here is that the Air Services Australia and then CASA, Civil Aviation Safety Authority, will be involved in developing the final flight paths. That's a lengthy piece of work. It's necessarily lengthy because you've got to consult with the airlines, with communities, with other stakeholders. There's several stages to it, including detailed consultation along the way. Just as a reference point, the Brisbane Airport at the moment is building a third runway, which will open in the next year or two. The detailed flight path planning for that runway has been underway for several years. So this is an important process. It takes time to get it right. There is extensive community consultation. But what's happened under the airport plan and the environmental impact statement is that the Commonwealth Government has identified a number of key principles that must be followed in the final planning of the flight paths, and one of those key principles is no single merge point over any residential area.
But can you understand, a lot of communities would be saying, before you give the big tick to this airport, you should do that first. We should be able to know what the aircraft noise impact is going to be on particular areas.
Well, it's important to be clear that this is about the regulatory approval for the airport to proceed. As I say, it's a bit like a development approval if you're building or renovating a house. And so that's really important. But there are a whole series of work streams that are underway and that will be continuing over a number of years. One of those work streams is then developing and finalising the specific flight paths that will be used. That's necessarily a multi-year process with extensive stages of consultation, and that has to be done in accordance with key principles which now have the force of law under the Environmental Impact Statement and the Airport Plan. For example, the principle that there will be no single merge point over a residential area.
Okay, so it'll be spread out across a whole lot of other suburbs, presumably those merge points, as they're called.
Can I make the point that there's a lot of areas which are not densely populated around the airport? That really reflects 30 years of development being restricted since the land was first acquired by the Hawke government in the mid-80s. And so...
Okay, but we shouldn't pretend that some suburbs aren't going to cop it here, Minister, should we? I mean, that's the reality of an airport.
Well, but really what is quite significant about the location is that it's been set aside for some 30 years as the potential location for an airport. As a consequence, residential development has been very substantially restricted. The closest housing to the airport is some 10 kilometres away. Very, very different to the situation, for example, in relation to Kingsford Smith Airport. Now, it is important that the flight paths be developed in a way that minimises the impact on residential areas. But the point I'm making is that as a consequence of restrictions on development around the airport over 30 years, we're starting from a position where there are extensive areas which are only very lightly populated or do not have extensive residential development.
And this gets to this gets to the decision around the nighttime flights, because unlike Kingsford Smith Airport in the east, which shuts down at night, this Badgerys Creek Airport will be able to run right around the clock. And the runway, I heard you announce today, it will be big enough to take A380s, the biggest plane there is right now. So does that mean we will see international flights that are often circling to try and avoid landing until the curfew at 6 o'clock in the morning in Kingsford Smith Airport? Are they going to be likely to land at Badgerys Creek right through the night?
Look, as you rightly say, the runway will be 3,700 metres, so that is capable of taking an A380, the largest civil passenger aircraft regularly in use today. Now, it's important to understand that the numbers of passengers using the airport are going to be markedly lower than Kingsford Smith Airport. So Kingsford Smith Airport has just ticked over about 40 million passengers a year, the busiest airport in Australia. In its opening years, Western Sydney Airport will be 3 to 5 million passengers a year, expecting to rise to about 10 million passengers by the early 2030s.
But how many, my question is, how many during the night? Given Kingsford Smith shut during the night, a lot of those would be during the night, do you think?
I think that it's likely that the travel patterns will reflect market opportunities. So certainly the daytime will be considerably busier than the nighttime. But yes, there will be some flights at night, and that will ultimately be a factor of whether there are whether there are flights coming in at that time, taking off at that time, reflecting market conditions, reflecting where people want to travel.
Now, can I turn to the rail question? Because this would seem, to me anyway, to be a pretty important factor for whoever's going to commit the billions to build the airport. What's the rail link going to look like? Is it going to be a unique rail link back to the city? Is it going to be linked up to the South West Rail Corridor? Surely this has to be sorted out before anyone's going to commit to build it.
Well, let's start by putting it in context. You need to have very good ground transport connectivity to the airport. That's why the Turnbull and Baird governments have committed to a $3.6 billion Western Sydney infrastructure plan. The Northern Road, for example, will be upgraded to 4 lanes all the way, and there'll be a new M12 that will run from the
and
existing
the roads are great,
M7.
and I get that the roads are very important for Western Sydney generally, with or without the airport. But the rail links, airports need rail links, don't they?
Well, can I just finish the point about road, and then I'll come to rail. So the M12 will connect the airport from the day it's open into the Sydney Freeway network, and of course, buses will travel over that, so there'll be public transport from the outset. Now, in relation to rail, the airport is being developed to be rail ready. It will have a station box, that's to say an excavation where a station will go. It'll have a reserved corridor across the airport site for rail. And at the same time, the Turnbull government and the Baird government are working together on a scoping study into the rail needs of Western Sydney and Western Sydney Airport. That scoping study issued a discussion paper earlier this year. We've had extensive community responses, and final advice will come to the two governments by the middle of next year. Now, what the Prime Minister has said...
I get that's important to have a scoping study and take your time, middle of next year and all of that, but an investor has to make a decision right now, or in the next, 4 or 5 months on this airport, whether to build this airport. Surely that question about the rail link is pretty important to the commercial decision on building the airport, isn't it?
It's important over the long term, and rail will certainly be important in terms of connectivity to Western Sydney. But one of the reasons the scoping study is framed as being about both the rail needs of Western Sydney Airport and Western Sydney is that on the passenger numbers that the airport expects to generate in the first few years, that of itself will not be sufficient to justify a rail connection. So 3 to 5 million passengers. Around the world, a good metric is around 20% of passengers come by rail. Some airports are higher, such as Gatwick near London, which is about 40%, but 20% is about the right number, and that's roughly where Kingsford Smith is right now. Now, on those numbers, you couldn't justify rail just for connectivity to the airport. But,
it'd
of
be,
course,
I mean, look, I'm no expert here, but it would seem you can get a cab from, city around Sydney to Kingsford Smith Airport, or you can get a ride there with someone. But to get to Badgerys Creek Airport, that becomes pretty cost prohibitive, given the distance you'd be travelling there. A rail link, therefore, would seem to be even more important to that Western Sydney Airport than the Kingsford Smith one.
Really what it turns on is the airport's catchment area. There'll be about 2 million people who are closer to Western Sydney Airport than to Kingsford Smith Airport. Let me give you an example that was given to me by the chief executive of one of the airlines. He said to me, today we have passengers who are taking a $60 fare from Sydney to Melbourne, but they're paying $180 by cab fare to get from Western Sydney to Kingsford Smith Airport. So the point is that when it comes to the ground transport connectivity and the airport passenger numbers in the early years, rail is not something that can be justified just on the basis of the airport numbers in the early years. But a couple of points, and this is why the Prime Minister has said he wants the scoping study to look at the question of can rail be there when the airport opens, or if not, then how soon afterwards. First of all, while you may not be able to justify rail on the passenger numbers straight away, if it's also, as it inevitably would, serving other locations in Western Sydney around the airport, then you may be able to make a case to bring it forward more quickly. And secondly, of course, as the passenger numbers rise over time, certainly the rail connectivity becomes more and more important. Just recently, for example, I had the chance to visit Changi Airport in Singapore. Now, that didn't have rail connectivity when it opened, but that came a few years later. If we look at Kingsford Smith Airport, the rail connectivity arrived in time for the Sydney Olympics, but for many years there hadn't been a rail connection. So we are certainly looking...
Badgerys Creek might be built and then the rail might come some years later, is what you're saying.
The key point is we've got a public policy process underway to look at what's the right route for a rail connection, when should it be built, how much will it cost, how will it be paid for, and it's through that public policy process we'll work out the options and determine if, as the Prime Minister has said, can we have a rail connection there when the airport opens, or if not then, how soon afterwards.
And one of those options, would one of those options involve Commonwealth financing, at least in part?
Well, again, that's exactly why we're having a scoping study, to look at all of those options, determine what it's going to cost, how should it be paid for. If, for example, the rail allows particular areas to be developed, for example, for commercial activity near the airport, is there a prospect of property developers making a contribution to the cost under what's called a value capture model. Now that's
yeah, but I mean, maybe this is an unfair comparison, but there's a debate about whether the government's going to lend $1 billion to the rail link from the Galilee Basin, coal mines Adani and so on to help, get that going. This would seem to be a pretty a good investment if you were going to do that as well, offer $1 billion loan to get this project up and going.
Well, I think the most important point is let's get the detail through the scoping study process so we can make a judgment on that. But of course, let's also focus on getting the airport itself delivered. That is really key. And what we've arrived at today with the airport plan being approved now means there is regulatory approval for the airport to proceed. We've never reached this point before in the 30+ years that governments have been talking about an airport at Badgerys Creek. It took a coalition government in 2014 to commit to a Western Sydney airport at Badgerys Creek, and the Turnbull government is making methodical progress, including getting the regulatory approvals in place. And before the end of this year, we anticipate issuing the notice of intention to Sydney Airport Corporation Limited, the owners of Kingsford Smith Airport, who have a right of first refusal in relation to the opportunity to build and operate Western Sydney Airport.
All right, Paul Fletcher, Minister for Urban Infrastructure. It is a fascinating project. It has been a long time coming, but I appreciate you joining us with the significant development, as you put it today. Thanks so much for that.
Thanks, Doug.